Yes. I'm gonna.
Now, will you pull this up on the screen or?
Yeah, I'm
Okay,
gonna pull it up.
okay, okay. How's, good, thank you. How's the baby?
He's been
Does he have his own pass?
He loved it. You would have thought we had him on Space Mountain. I mean, it was just.
Okay. Watch the cord.
I can do the questions and lead us through
That's
it, but you
fine.
can do it.
No, that's fine.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, I think we can do it.
Perfect,
All right, we'll
yeah.
see. Thank you, just interrupt me if I'm, okay.
No, that's good. Okay, if we can have everyone take a seat and gather the last people from the outside coming in. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Sandy Newton. I'm president of the Civic Federation, and I wish you all a happy new year. We want to thank the board for allowing us to use their chambers, very nice, and for sharing a conversation with us this evening. With a quorum present, I call the meeting to order. If you all could stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you so much. There were minutes out when you sign in, and if you've not signed in, there's sheets are over on this side so that we can count you. Did everyone get a copy of the minutes? Or you have the minutes? Okay, great. Are there any corrections or additions to the minutes? Okay, thank you. So we will approve the minutes. Thank you. The treasurer's report. We are getting dues in constantly. We're going to wait until February to do our treasurer's report because it's somewhat scattered right now. Are there any new delegates or alternates here tonight? Okay. Welcome, everyone. I want to thank the board. Thank you very much for letting us come on your turf. And also thank you to Kendra for all the help that she's given too. She's been great. And nice to see her face rather than the phone, so yay. and to Arlington TV for filming. Thank you. The board, if you are not familiar with them, they are in order. Katie Crystal, Christian Dorsey, Libby Garvey, new chair, Eric Gutschall, vice chair, and Matt DeFerenti. Thank you all very much. We are going to kind of dispense with opening statements because most of you were here for the organizational meeting, and that'll give us more time for our conversation. We have a New Year gift for you. It is the 100 years that we're celebrating this year, and your civic associations and member organizations can help with pictures, anything that you have. We were, in 1916, the Alexandria Civic Federation. So to learn a little bit more about that, we have Charlie Clark. He is an author, he's a columnist, he's a historian, and he's a very good friend. And he's going to give us a thumbnail sketch of this history. So go ahead, Charlie.
Happy New Year, everybody. So I wanted to talk to you all about my contribution with the Arlington Historical Society to the marking of Arlington's 100th anniversary, which is the creation of this story map, which was released a couple of months ago. And it's an interactive digital map, and it shows you how Arlington looked in 1920. And I was just going to give you a little background on how we arrived at this. Several years ago, former Treasurer Frank O'Leary and Delegate Patrick Hope and I had been talking about trying to document a little better why the Arlington's name was changed and what kind of legislative record there might have been in Richmond. And it was a little mysterious. But I knew that the anniversary was coming, and I happened on the concept of what's called a story map. And the software is a company in Redding, California called Esri. They're worldwide. I'm not really a techie. I can impersonate one as needed for organizational projects. And so I figured that there's a lot of books and a lot of photos, but when you have photos without a location, it's not quite as vivid. And so the story map allows you to see not only what's in the picture and with a credit and a caption, but it allows you to locate it exactly in the neighborhood and down to the intersection that it was in Arlington. And so it became a good tool to teach people about Arlington's geography. And so first thing I did, I contacted the Arlington Real Estate Office, and I wanted to thank, it's Rick Millman who gave me a database of houses that were built before 1920. And then I talked to the Arlington Digital Map Center. It's Jamie Gilland who helped me there. And then I talked to the Arlington Historical Society, which I'm a member, and they eventually gave me a grant, and I used some of that money to obtain photo permissions and a little bit of labor. And then I got some excellent volunteer help from my Historical Society mate, Tom Dickinson, who's here tonight, and from Eric Dobson at Preservation Arlington. And on the Historical Society, Kathy Hicks and Jerry Laporte and Annette Benbow. And so I have all the major books on Arlington in my home, and I went to a lot of the websites for churches, schools, and I did some research at Library of Congress and National Archives and the Virginia Historical Society, and we put them all together. And the idea was there's not many pictures of people. The idea was to recreate the atmosphere of what it would be like if you were strolling or riding on horseback in 1920, and what you would actually see in Arlington. And so that allowed us to use vintage pictures when they were available, but it also allowed us to take current day photographs of structures that were there in 1920, and we tried to minimize the modern telltale appurtenances. And then I was very fortunate to hook up with a software firm, which is right across the street here, called Blue Raster. And I happened to read about them, and they do digital map in the Esri software for a living. And they agreed to help me for no charge, which I'm very grateful to them for. And so we plotted out all the locations, and we have the 1920 street names most visible, but the modern names are there. It's underneath the software, so you can plot things precisely. And we tried to create every neighborhood. We tried to create average housing as well as fancy housing. You know, a lot of the historical tours of Arlington feature the prominent homes that were wealthy people met when they were built in the 19th and early 20th century, but also maybe are still occupied by people who have the financial wherewithal to maintain a historic house. So, and then I had to rely on a lot of websites for the churches and for some of the schools. And so then I was very pleased when the county got revved up its project to mark the 100th anniversary, and the Civic Federation started chiming in too. And I was very pleased that the county came up with the coverage in the Washington Post from 1920 and earlier, where what was then the Alexandria Civic Federation had complained that there was confusion about the difference between Alexandria County and the city of Alexandria. There's always been some legends about that, about the military flyover that supposedly went to the wrong place. But I think the coverage shows that it was really more that the average citizens who wanted to attend this picnic right after World War I to commemorate the veterans, some of them ended up going to the city of Old Town instead of the Arlington courthouse that we would know today for the event. And so that was the last straw. And so in that coverage that the county and the Civic Federation came up with, they also talked about the alternative names that were considered to rename Alexandria County. And it was Alcova or Pocahontas or George Washington. Can you imagine the confusion of naming something else for George Washington? But so, and exactly why they named it Arlington, you know, it's obviously for Arlington House, but the histories say, well, that's really as a tribute to Robert E. Lee. Now, it's true that Robert E. Lee was still very fashionable in the 1920s, as we all learned during the W&L renaming thing. But Arlington House, of course, was built by George Washington Parke Custis, who lived in it for about 55 years before Robert E. Lee did. So I just noticed that it didn't say precisely that it was named for Robert E. Lee. So that's you all are welcome to go on the Arlington Historical Society.org website and play around with this. And you can zoom in. You can send individual shots of it to friends. And I'll be speaking on it later, and I hope to gather some fun material on individual pictures so people have memories of some of these structures. And then after it was published about 6 weeks ago, we did some crowdsourcing, and we added about 4 more pictures that people suggested. And Cynthia Liche Torres had asked me to add the 16 county history designated zones or whatever it's called. Yeah, so I added those in there. So it becomes a little more of a joint county project. So that's all I have. Yeah.
Okay. At Marymount, the Wrench Library, on January 9th, Charlie will be doing an expanded presentation. I work in the garden at Arlington House, so, and it was named after an ancestral home, no offense, but before George Washington Parke Custis. So I'm a history geek, worked at Mount Vernon, so whatever. So, now we are going to have our conversation with the board. Oops. Okay. Okay. So we're going to have our conversation with the board, and I want to tell you, thank you for the invitation to this tradition, I guess now,
I think
maybe.
so.
We have to be
years?
invited. 4 years, right. And we sent topics and questions that were developed by our committee chairs that were of interest to them. And so that was sent ahead of time, and Libby's going to kind of take over that part. And then afterwards, we'll have time for some open mic questions if we don't cover them. Okay, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you so much. And I want to thank you all for coming here because it makes it, we used to go to the hospital and where you all meet regularly, and that always felt kind of like not so friendly, and it was removed. And this is just, I'm hoping sort of an informal conversation a little bit so we can really have a discussion, which I think is really great. And it is. We've been doing this for 4 years now, and it's wonderful. So, and thank you all for coming for, listen. Somebody has to listen to our speeches, right? I mean, it's great to have you here. So thank you. So I'm going to go down the questions, and I'll just kind of, somebody's going to take them, and we'll actually try to answer them pretty quickly, and see if anybody's got some comments back and forth, and then leave time for questions from the floor, if that's okay. So as I say, it's sort of more conversational. So I'll take the first one myself, which was I'll read the question if that's all right. The independent county auditor, which the Civic Federation strongly endorsed, has so far proven his worth by producing several public safety overtime and ambulance fee reimbursement audits, but has a small budget of only $250,000 per year. Would the county board support an increased county auditor budget to help accelerate various audit subjects that are in the auditor's 2020 and 2021 work plan? And in some, basically, yes, we have talked to our auditor and about beefing up his budget some so he can do a little bit, get more done. And told him we welcome him submitting a budget to the county manager that would be an increase for him. And we expect to fully see that in the budget, I think. But when it comes down to the budget, I don't know if any of us here, maybe somebody does, but I don't know if we want to promise to vote for it because you have to get it in the context of the budget. But basically, we agree with you that this is a good idea, and the auditor, I expect, is going to, we'll see something in the budget. Do any of my colleagues want to say anything more? Or anybody out there want to say anything? We'll go to question number 2. Okay. Second question, reserve funds balances. Both this year and last, the county manager in budget closeout remarks said that the county must adopt a longer-term approach towards gradually increasing reserves in order to preserve the county's top credit ratings. We believe, that being the Civic Federation, believe that the community can assist the manager in this regard. Will the board support leveraging the expertise of the Civic Federation's Revenues and Expenditures Committee, the county auditor, the county treasurer, and the Fiscal Affairs Advisory Commission, the FAC, to work on this key initiative together? And I will invite Katie and Christian, I think, to answer. Who goes first? Christian?
I think I take
All
this
right,
one.
thank
So thank you, Ms. Garvey. So, one, I'll take the first part of the question first. Can the community assist the manager in this regard? Well, it already does, actually, and it's part of our annual process of budgeting. But before I sort of explain that conclusion, let me just give a little bit of context. So, the county has, for the last 19 years, received the coveted AAA bond rating from the ratings agencies. We are, among a relative minority of jurisdictions that so receive a AAA. But when you compare Arlington to those other peer jurisdictions, the amount that we devote to reserves is substantially less. In fact, whereas the median of local area peer jurisdictions is about 10% devoted to reserves, we, with the manager's intended proposal for this upcoming year, will be at 6.5%. So this is obviously not a fatal flaw. We still receive the AAA, but it becomes increasingly important to the ratings agencies that Arlington move closer to its peers. And ratings agencies, and this is not a statement as to whether or not this is the correct policy, they're right in wanting this, but they see reserves as a critical element of responsibility and fiscal strength. So that's the background. In terms of how we go about devoting whatever we do to reserves and creating the wherewithal to increase them, that's really, you can't disentangle that from the budget process, which our community is extensively involved with, including our beloved Fiscal Affairs Advisory Commission, but also including the CivFed's Revenue and Expenditures Committee. All of those comments, viewpoints, ideas, analysis goes into shaping what is ultimately adopted policy, adopted budget policy by the board, implemented by the county manager, who also, as part of his work, consults with the treasurer and other financial experts. So for me, as I hear this question, I don't quite understand, like, what's the thing that needs, you know, that we really need to bring to the table to improve it. You know, we ought to actually celebrate the fact that our community comes together to, you know, work with the board and staff to produce the kind of balance sheet that the ratings agencies for nearly 2 decades have blessed as being at the upper percentiles of what municipal governments do. So, you know, Madam Chair, at the, not in the interest of prolonging this conversation, but I would love, if there's a different perspective to this question that I'm not quite getting, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to invite that because I think that's what you're, anybody want to respond to what Christian said? Somebody way in the back? Yeah, do. Is it okay if we use first names?
Yeah, let's do that.
Is that all right? I'm sorry, I'm just.
Thank you. I was going to go up to the podium, but I wasn't prepared for the roving mic. Duke Banks, I'm here for representing the Historical Society for tonight. But to Mr. Dorsey's observation, and for some of you who don't know, my background is also in municipal finance. One of the things I think it's important to note, we're very fortunate to have a AAA rating, but I think it's also important to recognize that a good reason for the AAA rating has had to be because of the social strata of Arlington County. We're a very well-to-do county. We have a track record of approving bond issues, and effectively, if you have the same community but does not have that social economic dimension that we have with our average income, we would probably only be a AA, not a AAA. So the community involvement in the social economic aspect and our approval of bond ratings or bond issues, and over the years, is a good factor why we have the AAA rating. There are issues concerning, you can debate all day of whether or not 6.5%, 7%, 10% the reserves might be, but as a member of the Revenue and Expenditure Committee, I think one of the real questions is there are reserves built on reserves. We also have school board reserves, and effectively, the question I think comes up whether or not we need to put that much money in reserves when we have a lot of other outstanding program needs, and whether those, some of those monies should go to address some of those issues. As an example, the stormwater issue that we have.
Thank you. That helps, and I can just briefly respond to that. And thank you, Mr. Banks. So, the question of how much we put in reserves, let me just take a step back. Nobody wants to put money in reserves that could be better utilized in delivering programs or services or tax rate reductions. That's not what I think excites any of us, nor does it excite the manager. And the amount to put in reserves is not really about our guessing. It's about the annual conversation that our staff has with the ratings agencies, which actually doesn't include politicians, and it is not going to include people in the community for reasons that I hope you could accept as valid. So that guidance is really driven from the ratings agencies, and what we've done is to try and increase reserves in the most flexible way possible by putting them into the manager's operating contingent as well as the economic stabilization reserve. So it's not as fully encumbered as some of the other legally encumbered reserves. So we are trying to make sure that as little of our money as is necessary to maintain good standing with the ratings agencies, and that coveted AAA are tied up in reserves. And while I get your idea that you would love to have some greater conversation about it, necessarily that's probably not a wise idea to try and figure out how to politicize that process of understanding what will satisfy the ratings agencies on an annual basis.
Okay, all right, we ready for the next question? All right. The third question was on Housing Arlington and school seats deficit. The county's Housing Arlington initiative, including its missing middle study, is geared to accommodating Arlington's growing population. And while Amazon's contribution to affordable housing is laudable, increased density and housing units inevitably contribute to Arlington's already overcrowded schools and a growing deficit of school seats. Question is, in what ways is the county working with APS to meet this growing seats deficit, and why hasn't Amazon been asked to contribute funds to help address K-12 schools' capacity? And Mr. Eric, you're going to take that one. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. This question, I could have written this question myself, maybe. It tees up a lot of really excellent, really excellent points that I think are really important to cover. And first and foremost, though, I think that, I could have written the question, but actually I want to note one sort of something that's embedded in the premise that I think our school board members, if they were still here, might beg to differ, and that is whether or not there is a growing deficit of school seats. We could see the deficit of seats could increase again in the future, but we actually just reopened 2 schools and opened 3 brand new facilities this September. And so as we look at that trajectory of where we are in the seat deficit, it actually will have taken a significant dip this year. Doesn't mean that it couldn't go back up in future years. And so that gets to the real question that I think is at hand here, which is, so what is the county doing in collaboration with the school board to make sure that we're able to meet school needs on into the future? And that gets to our public facilities plan, the PFAC, that the JFAC is working on right now. And so we're in the middle of a scoping process with the JFAC, Joint Facilities Advisory Committee, to scope out what kind of plan do we want. And we're really, everything is on the table. So it could be, it's not likely to be a super exhaustive, 125-page document, and neither is it likely to be just a 2-page, overall summary. It's going to be somewhere in between there, and that's meant to let you know that what it's ultimately going to be is still on the table and still being discussed by the JFAC, and will ultimately be decided by this board when they come forth with their recommendation later this spring. But what we do know is the board set in a resolution that we adopted, or direction that we gave to the manager early in 2019, that we want to begin writing this public facilities, schools and community facilities plan no later than July of 2020. So what are we doing? We have everything in motion, a process to begin writing that long-term comprehensive plan. It's important to keep in mind that we are talking about long-term here. There are going to continue to be the immediate, nearer-term, more urgent needs where we have to open a school in a particular location that meets a particular number of seats by a date certain. This long-term plan is not going to help us open a new school by 2025, for example. But the long-term plan will help us to look at those longer-term years and to have something in place by which we can find those seats. And Mr. DiFerranti also in his comments earlier mentioned that just earlier, or not this month because we're now in January, but earlier in December, the county manager had sent a letter to the superintendent that specifically outlined, I believe it was about 24 county-owned sites that could possibly have schools on them. In order to unlock those sites, if you will, we will need a full process because any existing uses on those sites would have to be either accommodated or improved or expanded. So for example, Central Library, just one example, is on that list. But in order to use Central Library as a possible site for a school, we obviously would have to figure out what are we going to do with the library. And we would assume, this board I think assumes that library uses are going to continue on, but they might evolve. So we would look at those opportunities to co-locate and how can you How can we be a little bit more creative and collaborative about that? And finally, I do, because it's a little bit embedded in the question, and I don't want it to go without saying, that whether you're talking about stormwater infrastructure, schools infrastructure, our roads, our parks, any kind of recreational opportunities, all of those things that people expect from their county government, expect as to be part of a quality of life in the city. I think the board looks at it, it's our obligation to provide those for whatever citizens that we have, and we would never want to use our ability, or frankly our inability, as some might try to coin it, as a means to exclude people. So yes, Housing Arlington is about figuring out how are we going to welcome more people to the county, but I believe it's our fundamental goal here, and it's our obligation, in fact, to make sure that we welcome people and we provide the services and facilities that they will need to enjoy the same quality of life that we currently have.
So thank you, Mr. Gutschall. I'm going to put on my Civic Federation hat. That was very helpful and a really good context. And under the first part of the question, there was a very specific second part of the question.
Sure.
Which is, why haven't we asked Amazon to come
right.
and pay for our schools? Yeah, do you want to take that?
I would love to, because I think it's a short answer, which
Yep.
is they're going to be paying quite a bit in taxes. So we are asking them to fund. We're not asking them to fund directly with community benefits that come out of their site plan approvals. And frankly, we'll be getting a lot more in the longer run towards their country. Every tax dollar that they pay, 46.7% based on the revenue sharing agreement, will go to the schools. And it's I don't have the number off the top of my head. I'm sure maybe Katie or Christian do, but it's going to be, it's like 170 million over the 20-some year period.
A little less, but.
Yeah, it's a lot of money that they are going to be paying. The figure of 23 million in terms of the small portion of the increase in the hotel tax that they will get back as part of the incentive agreement pales, and first of all, that's new money, and that pales in comparison to what they're actually going to be paying directly into our general county revenue. So absolutely, they will be contributing. And they're also, we've already seen this, and I think we'll see it especially as the manager brings forward the revenue projections for this budget cycle, that we announced earlier that we're expecting the office vacancy rate to now be under 15%. You can never ascribe exactly how much of that is due to the Amazon effect, but I think it would be foolish to presume that it's had no impact. So overall, Amazon has been very good for our revenue picture, and that's going to help build schools and help operate schools.
Thank you. Anyone want to do some back and forth on this one, or shall we move in? Rick? Oh, I'm sorry, Sandy, yes. I think Rick Epstein in the back there.
I guess a two-part question, Eric. Oh, Rick Epstein, Arlington Forest. Thank you, my conscience over here. If it's true that Amazon will be contributing to education through taxes, they're also contributing to affordable housing through taxes. Why distinguish and expect them to pay through community benefits for affordable housing and not ask them to also provide community benefits for education?
I imagine some of my colleagues might want to weigh on this, so I'm going to try to be very brief on this, which is, because I think there's probably different takes on this. The reality is if we wanted to use a contribution of community benefits towards schools in the same way that we do for affordable housing, for example, I think that is absolutely within our prerogative to do, but it would be important to understand that it's not a net gain in terms of overall community benefits. We would be simply reassigning what we're putting community benefits towards. So if there were benefits that were going towards schools by direct funding from a site plan application, whatever is left unfunded, whether it be transportation improvements or open space improvements or affordable housing, we would have to make that up elsewhere. And I think that the shorter answer to all of this is that our site plan, special exception site plan process has just been geared, for better or for worse, and it's certainly a discussion we can have about whether we ought to change it, but has been geared towards those community benefits that are more directly attributable to the site plan that's in front of us.
In other words, money's fungible, so there's so much money, and you can move it around wherever, but if you move it to here, it leaves there, and that there's a hole in that, or you can move it around there. So it just depends on what you want to use the money for. Asking for something isn't going to produce more money from the sites. It's just a set amount of money. So it's, and because money's fungible, you could move it around, but you still have to make up the deficit elsewhere.
Libby, if I may?
Yep. You want to say that more clearly? Please do.
Just a different dimension of the same idea. When you consider the $20 million contribution, we structured it a little bit differently from Amazon. It will either be paid out in stages according to as they build, or if we identify a use for that money tomorrow, it will come in one lump sum. And there's a direct nexus between Amazon bringing in, developing a headquarters that's going to bring in workers who could potentially displace and create a greater need for housing dollars than just simply Amazon contributing to a pot for schools. So there's the notion of nexus and the notion of being able to structure it so that the money gets out the door tomorrow. Sure, it would be a benefit to sock money away into a fund for schools when we need them, but we already do that through school bonds and other things, which again, as has been mentioned, taxes will help fund and pay for. So, this is something where you get the ability to use resources to directly offset an impact that's going to be coming, and you get to utilize it right away.
Okay. We ready for the next question?
Could I add one?
Yes. No, please do. Please do. Oh, yeah, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not seeing
So
it. Go ahead.
thank you. I just wanted to chime in actually back to the original question. And first of all, applaud one of the things that you all put in your premise, which I particularly really resonate with, which is that the Housing Arlington initiative is geared towards accommodating Arlington's growing population. And I think sometimes there is a conflation that housing is somehow causing our population growth, when in fact housing is part of the infrastructure in the same way that schools, transit, parks, and so forth are. We know our population is growing. If you don't build the infrastructure or allow to be built the infrastructure to keep up with it, it's going to have really real consequences, whether that's crowding on our road if we don't build the transit infrastructure, overcrowded schools if we don't build the education infrastructure, or in the case of housing infrastructure, if you don't allow that to be built, then we see it by in the form of outrageous prices in housing. And that's the way the market has worked in Arlington. So I was really pleased to see the way you all had phrased that about accommodating Arlington's growing population. And the CIFED's been great partners to us in thinking and sometimes really pressing us to consider infrastructure to accommodate a growing population. And I believe the premise here really shows that housing is part of that infrastructure as well.
Great, thank you. All right, next question, it's short. Budget cycle. Is there a chance that the budget cycle could be a 2-year cycle? Ms. Bristol.
This is a really interesting curveball. So as such, I'm mostly just speaking for myself and would invite my colleagues to say otherwise. So from a municipal finance perspective, and I'm sure Duke could educate us even more fulsomely than I will attempt to do, but there are certainly pros and cons to doing annual versus biannual or biennial budgeting, which, for example, we see in the Commonwealth. Speaking for me, I think there are certainly trade-offs, but I would make the case for doing the 1-year budget cycle that we do here in Arlington County. And the best anecdote actually I can think of to illustrate that is what we've seen at the state level. You may all have followed, but the state was in line to receive a couple of windfalls last year. One was from the Wayfair decision, which basically said that states would now get a cut of online sales. And the other had to do with the federal tax cut plan, which essentially meant that the state, for reasons I will spare you now, was in line to receive a significant influx of cash. I think what you saw happening politically and in terms of the engagement of the citizens of the Commonwealth with regard to how to spend those two windfalls of money showed a way of engaging on the budget process that is not optimal. You had a bunch of plans being floated, for example. Senator Bill Stanley was doing a barnstorming tour of the Commonwealth with the argument that that ought to go to school capital around the Commonwealth of Virginia. You had others arguing forcefully that there was a state law or resolution from some years past saying that any new windfalls regarding internet sales taxes should be dedicated for transportation, and we had pressing transportation capital needs. And the important reality of all of this, and the reason I tell this rather belabored anecdote, is that we were in the second year of a 2-year budget process. There was no budget framework for us as citizens of Virginia or for the elected officials we send to Richmond to have the opportunity to weigh this new influx of money in a meaningful way, to look at the balance of investments in schools and schools' capital and education relative to transportation and transportation operating and capital. On balance, I think the way that we do things in Arlington, the noise and democratic participation that happens around each of our budget processes are productive. I think it allows us in a given year to look at our revenue picture and to honestly assess our relative priorities in context of one another, rather than dealing with a one-off influx of money or, God forbid, the alternative.
Yeah, right, thank you. Any follow-on conversation on that? Are we ready for the next question? I see a hand in the back. Why, it's Duke Banks again. Duke.
Katie, you mentioned my name, so I will come back.
Tell me why we should do 2-year budget.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think there are two things to look at this on. The question is actually geared in the sense is that, for the CIP, you have a 10-year window that is out there. And part of the thing is looking at the long-term planning and assumptions, going off, into the future. I think the 2-year framework was a softball question, not to say you can also consider a 10-year operating budget. Not that, but you can only, because legally you can only do it on a year-by-year basis. But what it boils down to in the multi-year phrase, whether it's 2 years, 3, 5, or whatever, is to at least outline what are some of the basic assumptions coming on. And I guess, I think it might come up in another question on livability for South Arlington. There's going to be millions of square feet of construction going on in South Arlington because of the Amazon effect. That's going to bring in a lot of, questions, at how many million square feet do you need to start considering and justifying a fire station? How many million square feet are you going to need for the new, for schools? And not to mention parks and other things. So the question essentially of the multi-year question is to stay within the yearly operating thing, but it forces out, what are the assumptions. Last month here at Civic Federation, that we fortunately was at the same time you had your carryover meeting. Richard Steppenhouse, the budget director, came and he mentioned that they have do some, multi-year thinking out there, but there's not necessarily published, and some of that maybe should be considered, in terms of that of planning. So those are my couple of comments.
That's a great illustration of kind of what engendered this suggestion or question here. And I, Duke, I think you framed it brilliantly. In recent years, actually, we've seen our county manager in his sort of preamble to the budget, right, start to do some of that kind of multi-year operating implication. And I think it's certainly his goal, and I think fair to say one for us on the board too, to really enrich our conversations about the budget on that level. The other point that I'd make or pull out from what you just said is the relationship between capital and operating. I think we sometimes work under this kind of fiction that they really are separate budgets. But of course, what we're planning for in the capital budget, which we do update that 10-year plan on a 2-year basis, has implications for what's in the operating and to some extent vice versa, which of course relates to the comp plan, the comprehensive plan elements, particularly land use planning, which you indicated as well. So it's a great example of how everything sort of works together, and an excellent point. The other thing that Duke's question does enable me to do, which is point out one budget-related piece that I've promised Brian Helfer I'm going to get in here at some point because it's so important. One example of the way that our budget could change year to year would be if Arlingtonians did not participate in Census 2020. So I was really excited. I thought Dave was here wearing his Census 2020 purple shirt. It's a Gondola Now shirt, so I have to carry the water for Census 2020 myself. But the point is this: for every uncounted Arlingtonian, we lose $2,000 annually in federal funds. Multiply that out over the 10-year life of a census, we stand to lose $20,000 in federal support for every Arlingtonian that isn't counted. So when you get that census form or that postcard to participate online, please do be counted.
Good job, Katie.
Well done. Great PSA. Very well
We
done.
now know which board member is going to be the favorite in communications and public engagement, right?
All right. Okay.
Can I add a dimension to that?
Yes, you may. Please
So,
go right ahead.
The kind of scenario modeling that Duke mentioned, I would find incredibly interesting and helpful. I will say I throw it out there, and I love you all, and I love all of Arlington. but there is a fear that comes with that kind of scenario modeling that would come with it lots of assumptions, is that we would spend our year arguing about all of those assumptions and deciding whether or not the assumptions that went into a model of a potential out-year scenario was correct or not. And that is something that is probably not as useful, and I think would probably take away from the intent that Duke has in terms of the utility of all of this. Because, as we look at the future, we can make assumptions that if Amazon comes online, when it comes online, it will produce X, Y, and Z. But what happens if a recession happens in the interim, and when do you time that recession, and what's the tail of that recession and its impact on Arlington? You can get very quickly into huge intellectual conversations about assumptions that really eliminate any utility that such modeling could provide. So I'd love to talk more about how we might do it in a way that just doesn't tie us up in endless circles.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. All right, we're ready to, no, yes, Nicole.
So sorry, just trying to weave it into the same kind of discussion. Nicole Merlene, normal, but one of the questions that I did ask the man from the budget department was, and somehow we've kind of gotten into this dichotomy where you're either pro-growth or you're anti-growth, and I think that there is a way to kind of talk about growth in a way that you measure the growth and that there's data behind the impact of that, and you're able to plan for it in the future. And I think that there's, my question to him was, do you work with planning? So every time that there is a site plan approval, that there is a relative impact on schools, infrastructure, everything sent over to the budgeting side to calculate what the future operational budget of that impact would be. And he said that there was kind of a discussion, but do you have any insight as to what that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're up in our game substantially there. It's the public-facing document is a development tracker, which better enables both people within the organization, the public, and the schools to understand when development activity is happening so that they can then, based on their own organizational needs, determine what impacts they need to mobilize. But internally, that helps our Department of Management and Finance be able to sort of peg impacts on revenues, receipts, and expenditures, and peg it to development activity that's happening in the county. So that should be something that we grow and develop with greater sophistication. But then there's also the other piece of actually measuring the fiscal impacts of development, which has been a long conversation in our community. And other jurisdictions in Northern Virginia do this already. And Falls Church is one, for example. And generally what you're going to find, and not generally, absolutely what you're going to find is that smart growth development, at least according to the firms that have been engaged by the jurisdictions in Northern Virginia, find smart growth mixed use projects produce an overwhelmingly positive fiscal rate of return. So we think our community wants something a little bit more sophisticated than that. So we're trying to figure out exactly what that looks like. But the short answer to your question is yes, it's a growing body of work that we're going to hopefully get better at. Thanks, Nicole.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yes.
Can I jump in on that one?
Go right ahead.
Which is, at the risk of of patting myself on the shoulder and keeping with my theme from earlier of leveling up, I think that this is something, it is a growing body of work, and it's something we continue to get better and better at. And a great example of this is in particular on the student generation rate projections. I forget what meeting it was. It wasn't that long ago. We had, it was a joint work session, right?
Yeah, with our demographer.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
where we had the presentation from both our demography, our planning staff, and school staff, and how they are using, how they've really figured out how to better use the data that each has to really take forward, to level up the quality, the caliber of the analysis that we do, not only for the plans, the projects that we actually approve, but also for any what the potential build out would be for any given area. So it's still very, very difficult when we approve a specific project that has a specific student impact on a specific school. That can be hard. It sort of goes with what I think Christian was saying earlier, that as things play out, the very specific details can be hard to predict well in advance. But taken on the whole, how we are planning for everything, we absolutely are increasingly doing a better job at doing that.
Okay.
Lois
Right,
likes
we ready to move
Lois would
on?
like
Lois, yes.
I just wanted to amplify one thing I heard from Christian there that I really liked the sound of, and that was that we're not just doing a fiscal evaluation. Growth means more money. That seems sort of intuitive, but the idea that that we might have other measures that are a little more sophisticated, and that does bring us back to the livability discussion that CivFed had in the last meeting that's really being generated down in the Pentagon City, Crystal City, Arlington Ridge area. But I like that idea that there's more than one way to measure as well. And I say that as someone who's been a big proponent for looking at the fiscal impacts, but I'm happy to hear you talk about something that's a little more nuanced. Thank you.
And Lois, if I could just say thank you for saying it more articulately than I did a few minutes ago. And, you know, that's exactly right. I mean, there's just more to the conversation than whether does this ultimately pay for itself in the things that you can concretely peg, especially when we know that, you know, a high-density mixed-use project is going to always produce a positive net fiscal rate of return. I don't think our community wants to start evaluating projects and their utility by what that rate of return is. It's the totality of how that impacts our community and benefits our community, and that's what we, you know, don't have exactly a ready-made tool to do well, but is important.
All right, we ready to move on? Next question. The county manager was supposed to be looking into options for our member organizations, most particularly civic associations, on insurance. What is the status? And Katie told me that she actually last met with Civic Federation folks.
Yes, so we met,
yeah,
Mr. Banks and I, along with our county attorney, back in August of 2018 when I was chairing the board, and we really appreciate your bringing this to our attention as a longstanding issue. And at that time, we were talking about liability insurance in two forms. One of the issues was that liability insurance was required for civic associations to have special events like block parties or use county-owned properties such as parks, and that was costly and a burden on the civic associations. And civic associations, both capital C, capital A, and then small-scale civic associations, like Shirlington Dogs or other citizen groups. The other thing that we heard from you all at the time was that there was a concern about liability, about members of civic associations being sued in their personal capacity. And while I think it's helpful, I think Arlington has proved to be a little less litigious than some of our surrounding neighbors. That is a very real concern for people who step up to lead in the community, being worried about being sued in their personal capacity and potentially not, you know, having to pay for an attorney themselves. So on the first point, we had a great conversation, and the status of that was that we were going to make a connection with the Arlington Bar Association to see if they may be interested in providing some pro bono assistance to civic associations and citizen associations. Our attorney did look into this. We are not able to, for a variety of legal and insurance reasons, to extend the county's liability insurance, either the self-insurance or commercial insurance, to other organizations that are not the county themselves. But we did seek to look for that pro bono representation as a way of providing some relief to that concern. Our county attorney followed up, made a connection with the Arlington County Bar Association. I think it was either chair or vice chair. I actually don't know the status of where it went since there, but Mr. Banks can follow up. The other piece was that, again, the insurance coverage requirements for special events. And this is an area actually where, jumping ahead to the next question about the Civic Federation helping us, here's what I would find really helpful if we could make an ask of you all. We did take on at the time a potential to do of going department by department to see what the required coverage rates were. Throughout the county, from Parks and Recreation or Environmental Services for block parties or facilities rentals. Our county attorney was at the time of the impression that the coverage were relatively low, but we have not gone department by department and done that work. So what I wanted to ask the CivFed, if you all are open to it, is if you all could consider generating a list for us of the county facilities that you all have sought to use in the past on behalf of your organization, where liability insurance coverage requirements made it prohibitive prohibitive to do that. So whether that's hosting a block party and you needed an environmental services permit, whether that was using a park and you needed liability coverage to do that, let us know, please, if where liability coverage has been a barrier to you from hosting events and what department was involved, and that will really help us narrow down where we can focus improvements throughout the county about potentially relaxing the insurance coverage requirements for you to use those different facilities or parts of the county.
All right. Anything more? Mr. Banks? Duke?
Our chairmanships overlapped. Mr. Banks and I were just washed up chair emerituses now.
No, I think as the past president of the Federation, I think I need to give a report to compliment what you just did, especially the good follow-up with the Arlington Bar Association. And one of the things that I think we came out of that meeting was that there aren't that many specialists we have a lot of lawyers in Arlington, but they're not specialists on nonprofits. And in terms of working on this liability thing. So that has delayed a response on the Arlington Bar Association about how to go about it. We want to follow up a little bit with them, and it's one of my things to do. I wanted to do it before my term ended, but I have it on my to-do list to continue the follow-up on it, to compliment Sandy. But it's turning out to be a lot more difficult than was anticipated. But I think the biggest thing to keep in mind of the roughly 85, I think, member organizations, we have some 55 civic associations approximately. A lot of them have probably a budget between $1,500 to $2,000. Yet to get an equivalent D&O, directors and officers premium, it's approximately around $800, $900. It's a big chunk of their budget, and yet most of that budget is, to organize the block parties and whatnot, and they just don't have the means to do it. The other one is, ironically, we in the Civic Federation, after we we became, a file with a state board corporation as a 501c4 because we advocate for you, all these positions and, position papers and resolutions that we send forward, and you scuttle around not knowing what to do with it. At the end, because of that, we struck out general liability insurance from a lot of the carriers, and if we wanted to pursue it anymore, it would be probably a very steep premium that would affect us, in terms of our operating budget. That's just a follow-up report on that.
All right, more work to do. Next question, and Katie foreshadowed this. In what ways can the Civic Federation assist the county board in relevant issues across the county? And I'll ask Matt to answer this one. Let's get us started anyway.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just get to say that, so I'm going to throw it in there. So Katie's point, I think, is helpful. It's one of the four that I was going to kind of emphasize. And I think that you actually do very well on this, and I would encourage you to keep staying in touch. But the first is, I think it's helpful to, as you stay in touch on issues that come up, most of you will get this as leaders of the Civic Federation, but do both. Do both an email to us and then meet with us and then follow up, because you know by now that if you just do one, like if we get 3 emails in 1 week about something and never hear about it for 6 months, we're less likely to follow through on it than if we get both that email and an in-person meeting and then a follow-up over the coming months. It's not rocket science, but I just think it's a point that's worth making. You do a good job of this, and I think it's important to help us organize input from your association. There are, as you all know, there are instances where part of your neighborhood feels very, very strongly differently than the rest of your neighborhood. And that's fine, but it's just helpful for us to understand those differences, and to the extent that you're able to help organize those differences so that we hear all perspectives, I think that's going to help us. And then I will mention, Nicole, you mentioned the site, you mentioned the assessment of numbers of students generated. In our site plans, we do see an estimate. Our staff reports do include that, and I think hopefully it's fair to say it continues to be true that multifamily sites increase the number of students, but by far, single-family student generation is what has been driving our school growth. I don't know the precise percentage in all cases, but I do really feel that it's a significant majority. And then I think Katie made the good point of the livability framework is a great example. It's offering solutions that are really helpful to us, and offering those solutions is going to help your input and thoughts be most productive for you and for us as we try to find the ways forward. So those are just a few thoughts.
Okay, Mr. Gutschall.
Thank you, Matt. I think excellent response, and I agree with everything. The only thing I wanted to add to that is I do think that you have a role as a convener, as sort of the umbrella over all of the civic associations in terms of reinforcing good behavior and civility and making sure that as a community we can have what sometimes are difficult conversations. There's no doubt that we've had them in the past and we're going to have them in the future. We can't move forward without being willing to confront sometimes what are our natural tensions. But we have to be able to do that in a way that everyone feels that they have the opportunity to be heard. Doesn't mean being heard is not the same as being agreed with, but at least being heard. But I think really from your organization to set the tone that we're going to have these conversations in a civil way, and you should frankly also expect that of us, that we are respectful of the varying viewpoints. And so just civility, it's something that I know our chair, Ms. Garvey, has focused on quite a bit in her time here, and it bears repeating.
Thank you, Mr. Gutschall. Anything else? Ms. Crystal.
Make sure every member of your organization responds to the census.
Woo! Very good.
I'm the census liaison, so
You're doing great.
We are a partner with the census.
Yep. Can't say it enough, though, right? I think the structure of the Civic Federation is really incredible if you think about it. You've got, because Civic Station, when you're going to organize people, like say for emergency preparedness or something, right? Making sure everybody's got, I don't know, battery-operated radio or is signed up for Arlington Alert. How do you do that effectively? We're having issues with that. If you've got blocks or civic associations are small, you can even get smaller than that, and then you come together in the larger group. It could be, I think the Civic Federation is, but could probably be a lot better at getting information from the bottom up to us and from kind of when we're trying to things back down to people. I think possibly. I've noticed, I remember discussing with someone, I can't remember, it's fine that we get resolutions from you, and that's fine, but a lot of time probably goes into those resolutions, and sometimes, for us, I'd like to know what people are saying and thinking. And in fact, coming down to a consensus thing that everybody can agree on, sometimes I'd rather hear, like at a summary of a meeting that you had on some difficult issue, that, half the group thought this and half the group thought this, or maybe it's a third and two-thirds. When it comes boiled down in a resolution, that's helpful. It's the sense of the group as a whole, but sometimes it doesn't maybe keep us in touch as much as we might be with all of the thinking going on. So as a board member, I'm just really speaking for myself here, I think your role as a forum could maybe be expanded a little bit as a way of getting ideas out there and passed on to us. I also think that we're all dealing with the same thing, which is people are so busy. So there are a lot of people that don't have time to come to all kinds of meetings, our meetings, Civic Federation meetings, and we're working on how to do that too. Maybe you guys could experiment with some of that, and we can, online, maybe there's some online Civic Federation chat or something like that means people don't have to, try to get up and get out of the house and be at a certain place, and they've got, kids and a job and all of these kinds of things. So I just would encourage you to do that, and we can all kind of work together. It's really all on civic engagement and how to do it in the 21st century when people are so busy with what they're doing. So I just thought I would add that point. All right, are we ready for the last question? All right, last question that we have. This one came in, I think, late, so it's what flood mitigation. Will the county board establish a dedicated committee work group to develop a flood mitigation planning process and resilient Arlington flood mitigation plan? And I appreciate this. I know this came from Jackie. She talked to me earlier. So I think we need to have a discussion, because my first reaction on reading this was, well, we have one. That's what our staff is doing right now. So I'm different look. So, if you're going to come up with a flood mitigation planning process, I mean, you want people who are, I think, engineers, hydrologists, and professionals on that sort of professional level. Our staff has been working, and we could, do more of this, a lot with people who have experienced flooding and getting information from them, and that's been very helpful to our staff. But I'm not quite clear what you see as this planning group doing, because flooding and water, I mean, it does what it does, and it seems to me you need some professional expertise to understand that, so I must be missing something. Jackie?
Yes. It is to have a committee that is integrated, staff and citizens, to be able to look at that comprehensive, holistic picture of the planning. So yes, to have the data collection and so on from an engineering perspective, but this is essentially community planning also, just like all of the other community planning. And one of the reasons why we haven't progressed is that it has been at the bottom of a significant organization with other things. Stormwater is at the very bottom of at the bureau level. And it mostly deals with quality of water, and the budget mostly deals with quality of water. The issue of what a traditional mitigation plan would look like has not come up, or it's come up and we haven't taken it on. So in order to integrate everything, and I know you have a staff committee, we don't know what your staff committee is looking at. I applaud you for having an integrated staff committee. That's certainly a first step. But we want the civic process that we have, because this cuts across all of the other things. And we have ordinances, and every part of our comprehensive plan touches this at some point. So this is really a committee that would help you integrate across the comprehensive plan to have a truly resilient flood mitigation plan, not stormwater flooding.
Yeah, there's all kinds of flooding. Right. I think so I'm thinking while I'm hearing you talk, because I think our staff, as I remarked in our note, I mean, we are looking at some very different, I don't know what they all are right now, because they're, our professionals looking at it. I mean, all of our sort of plans kind of got thrown out of the window on July 9th. So we really are looking at things, and I think you're going to see, one of the things is, are we going to do cisterns like in parks? So that affects parks, right? They're all, and are we here are all talking about, the whole question, it's so much smaller. I think the sump pumps and the stuff that, development, and how is that working, and the trees getting cut down. So it really is a lot cross-cutting. I think maybe we'll go back and talk to our staff about, because I think at some point, touching base and talking with people is going to be really important, because as I was remarking, I mean, some of the plans I think our staff may come forward with, are they going to look different? And they're going to be people saying, whoa, I mean, what is that? That's, as I said, risky, when I was talking about what, innovation, or that looks different, or I don't know, why are we doing that? And people could get fairly concerned about it, understandably. So maybe getting some feedback earlier, so it's not presented as a whole kind of fully baked plan, but when the staff is ready to present some ideas, could do that with you and work with you on that. Mm-hmm.
Also, so that it's integrated with both the operating budget and the CIP, but as one area, not ad hoc. It's so complex that if the input is scattered, it will be very hard to understand, what the focus is. And in response to your question about how things came about, this was very spontaneous, very intense action by 4 civic associations that were greatly impacted by this most recent flood. And they have a task group as well as, but they were very much a part of this. And the resolution that you see that lists all different approaches was intentionally inclusive, not exclusive. So we gave all the list of things, of ideas that people came up with. And the one thing where there was disagreement is some people wanted us to push a particular piece of that. And we wanted to give you the full list, but we also want to talk about the full list, because there certainly are different opinions about where to start. The one thing everyone agreed on is it has to be all Arlington. It has to be by watershed. We need to understand the relationship, like the overlay of civic associations and the watersheds. And that's why we need one comprehensive gathering of this information.
Yeah, fair enough. Katie, I think you
So
wanted to
I just
say
wanted
something.
to suggest, I know our manager, so actually our staff spent a fair amount of time with your resolution, as did we, right? And I think, Jackie, you've really indicated that the amount of thought that came to the table in enumerating some of those potential solutions. And I know that our staff has actually crosswalked their existing efforts against what you all are doing. And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here, because our manager had said as much to us that they would welcome the opportunity to meet with a small group of Civic Federation stakeholders, yourself and a few of the other folks most involved, to basically share that crosswalk with you, to walk through what's already underway in that cross-departmental group compared to some of the suggestions you all have discussed. I would associate myself with our chair about whether it makes sense to stand up an ongoing committee to have to sort of yield some of the projects that we're very much hoping and expecting to see in our CIP, or whether it makes sense for them to partner with you to walk through the work underway and then help think about exactly that piece of engagement, because that's where you are going to be the experts. The example you just gave of crosswalking the watershed areas with this civic associations is a great example. So again, I don't think I'm speaking too far out of turn. You'd put it as much in writing about welcoming the opportunity to meet with you all. I think it probably makes sense to have a small group from that interdepartmental staff group meet with a small hands-on group of you all rather than an overall presentation. Okay, perfect. So let us know if we can help in making that happen. I know you have a good direct hotline to the manager too, but we're here to help make that connection as well.
Great. Stephanie.
Stephanie Pryor.
Go
Stephanie,
ahead.
I think
It's
I'm going to
all right.
let.
It's all good.
It's
Go
all
ahead.
good? Okay,
Yeah.
Stephanie, go ahead.
We might hopefully have a mind meld on some of this too.
We might.
So considering you're one of the neighborhoods that got impacted. So my name is Stephanie Pryor. I'm with the Penrose neighborhood, also a past president, dragged poor Mr. Duke Banks into all this. So Ms. Garvey promotes always her reading list. So this is something I would suggest that you all read, which is Martin O'Malley, Governor Martin O'Malley's book from Maryland. So what Maryland did, and also what the city of Baltimore did, is that they didn't have stovepiped. They literally looked at, which you probably can't see, but they looked at the overall watershed and they started to say, okay, what were the easy wins? What were the areas that got impacted? He also talked about Minnesota with the bridges and the infrastructures. So he started to show where the money was going up in Minnesota, one of the people up there with the open data effort and reporting efforts. He showed where the money was going, but yet showed where the problems were. And the simple geographic overlay with GIS maps showed a wide discrepancy. And that's part of what we're concerned about is with the watershed, some of the worst areas are not getting the attention. And yet something with a minor problem gets a neighborhood conservation plan to do a major work with a lot of effort or whatever. So through Maryland, since you guys are policy, and I realize that the county manager and staff actually do the day-to-day, but directing the policy to do those overlays, to get rid of some of the stovepiping, to help start to see the money tied with where the problems are. And you can't see this too well, but they literally, with the Chesapeake Bay, started to get down to individual streams, individual streets, and then they found the individual property owners that were contributing to some of these. And all of that was from open data, which we've kind of started here in the county. And I know Mark Schwartz told me earlier, just give me one idea. I said, can you take the whole book? But yeah, so I have to try to break it down to just one, although there are many more in here. So as policy directors for the county, please consider what Maryland did and what the city of Baltimore did and many other cities are doing currently.
Okay, that's great. I mean, this looks like our staff, I think, is somewhat taking that approach. I know they've been doing triage. In fact, after this storm, in fact, even before the July 8th storm, they had identified what are the worst flooding, and it's all, as I say, in a triage. And it's hard because if you're getting, once you get over a foot of water or something, right, it doesn't, so somebody gets 10, somebody gets 5, everybody's really hurting. But we are doing some of that, but it's cool to see the whole, and open data, I'm not going to be able to set up the systems to do that, but we are trying, and I appreciate the recommendation on the book and that way of approaching it. It's absolutely wise, and hopefully we're doing that. here. And that gets into the whole NCAC question. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that, but maybe not. Christian.
Yeah, just in terms of resilience, one area where I think we do need help, I mean, I think a long way of saying that while we necessarily haven't been on the ball for periods prior, I think July 8th reawakened a new way of thinking across many levels, and I think we're asking, give us a chance to demonstrate how we're going to evolve, and then include you with those plans. And we're certainly open to your feedback once that becomes apparent. One area where we really need help concretely. It's not about identifying watershed impacts. It's not about figuring out the actual data that supports investments. Is in figuring out how we actually notify, how we develop systems to become aware when there is an impending issue and provide the notification that can actually result in saving people's lives. As we realized on July 8th, had that storm been 4.5 hours prior, we may not have had a result where no one died. Not because of anything being different, other than the fact that people were generally awake, alert, and aware, and able to get themselves out of harm's way. It became all the more apparent that if we were in a different time situation, we would have been not as successful as a government in ensuring that people could be safe. That's a complicated issue, and I know you have a lot of expertise with this, Jackie, but it's not just about technology. It's about a whole system of early warning and then being able to rapidly notify. And that's, to me, it's a gap. It's a gap that July 8th made me acutely aware of. So even though we're going to do all we can to make sure that we minimize the recurrence of events like that, we're not under any illusion that we're going to be able to totally indemnify ourselves. What do we do if the worst happens?
Thank you. That's another PSA. I appreciate that one because, I think to be resilient, we need to be ready for anything. Hi, yes.
Hi,
Angela.
Kit Norland with Arlington Tree Action Group. I really would make a plea to listen to Jackie's proposal. And I want to go ahead and fast forward and give you a little bubble up experience, Libby, because I appreciate the point that we have a role to bring in the community concerns. Another colleague from ATAG and I met with staff recently about stormwater. And my colleague brought literally a decade's experience looking at a particular stream restoration and really had graphs and all the information. And I'm not kidding with you, Libby. One of the staff people in the room said, that was the past. Let's look ahead, i.e., no, we don't need to learn lessons from this. All this research you have done, let's just look ahead. So I think it really underscores the need to have people who are living the experience and the impact of stormwater at the table as soon as possible. Maybe not in an auditorium with 500 people, but please try to have them at the table sooner rather than later.
Well, and I think what Mr. Dorsey was talking about, I think having it probably even in small groups where you're really kind of working and discussing, I think can really be very helpful. Yeah.
Can I take a stab at this?
Sure, go ahead, Mr. Gutschall.
Thank you. I guess I'm going to repeat a little bit what's already been said, but maybe say it in my words, because sometimes how you hear it can change. And I think to the point of the suggestion from Governor O'Malley's book is actually, from what I heard you describe and where I think what we've seen from our staff since July 8th, they are taking that approach. So nothing that we've said should be mean to dismiss that, like, don't worry, we've got it. We are, in fact, taking that kind of approach with the heat maps and looking exactly at where are the trouble spots and making sure that what comes forward to us in the CIP processes, which is where we will put dollars to the plan, is making sure that we are getting the most bang for the buck and also through a lens of equity. It's not only, it's the 4 questions, right? It's not only how are we solving the problem, but for whom are we solving it? And so I wanted to make that very, very clear that we're not dismissive of the idea. We are actually acknowledging and accepting the idea. But then on the bigger picture issue, and Christian said this sort of, and I'm going to be a little bit more blunt about it, I think that it would be disingenuous of me to try to say, oh, we have this completely under control and we were doing everything exactly right prior to July 8th. This is just one of those storms. And some of that is true. It was an incredibly intense storm. of which if and when it happens again, there's no way that the 5 of us could sit up here and say that there wouldn't be adverse impacts, that somebody's basement's not going to get flooded, that God forbid somebody's not going to actually be injured or killed. It was a very serious storm, and actually, I think we are incredibly lucky that nobody was killed, even with the timing of that storm, that nobody was killed. I mean, you had picnic tables that were shooting through rapids down streets. It's actually amazing that nobody was hurt.
I actually considered it a miracle, and I've said that.
Yeah, it really was. And we can't count on miracles to keep the community safe. So when it should not, I understand why it might seem as though we're trying to just be dismissive, and if our staff were saying that was then, this is now. Work with us through the next several months, and let's get through this, and let's get to the process where we're actually putting dollars and decisions and putting a plan into action. And I agree completely that there's fundamentally a role for civic engagement. This is a role that absolutely the Civic Federation can fulfill. I think that you guys would be even more frustrated than perhaps our staff if we had a group that was stood up that got wrapped around the axle on some of the technical aspects of it. We should really focus the civic engagement on making sure, I love the way it was just described, making sure that the people who are actually experiencing the flooding have the opportunity to have input into the process. And we really need to, and it's more of an art than a science of discerning where do you want professional staff expertise and where do you need the people who are living with the impacts to have voice into the process. So I don't know if that added or clarified, but I feel better I got it off my chest.
Oh, that's
Thank
great.
you.
Well, it clarifies for me. I think, Sandy, you and I should be in contact because what's being asked for is a structure. So we're all saying we need to talk, but how are we going to, there's not a structure. So I'll talk with staff and we'll try to come up with some structures to make sure that, we can get the input and the participation we need.
One more suggestion, and that is on the broader topic of community engagement. This is something that has engaged the community in a way that other topics haven't before, or that this topic hasn't before. And right now, although you know that the staff is working on it and has a plan, it feels like we're waiting and we don't have a schedule and we don't know when we're going to hear back and we don't know what's happening. So from a community engagement point of view, there's considerable frustration because no one is seeing what the big picture is. They don't know, well, when are we going to get a report from this interdepartmental committee? What have they been tasked with?
So you'd like a progress report. I get it. You say that progress is being made and things are happening. Yeah, it's good.
The plan forward, and that's where a plan for how we're going to stay connected and have input is not available right now.
Yep. Thank you. We'll work on that. Yeah, sure.
Yes,
Well, this is your organization and your meeting, so.
Yeah, we've kind of gone over our time. So.
Sure, I think I probably.
Hi, Mary Glass, ATAG. A couple of general points.
You hold the microphone closer to you.
Yeah, I think it's important because we're all in some ways leaders in this room. And I think it's really important when we're looking at this issue and really all the issues that come up. Are we looking at it in a long-term perspective, or are we simply trying to solve the immediate problem? And I think stormwater may be a good example that things are not going to get better, they're going to get worse. And are the old tools what we need, or do we need to take on something far more controversial? In the case of stormwater, it may be that we have to take on something that's politically not acceptable. We may have to do something that requires something of all the residents of Arlington, not simply putting in more sewer pipes, but actually going back and asking them to make sacrifices and or contribute more money. And so it's a big, difficult process. But I also think it's really important, the point that Jackie's making. Engagement is not telling us what you've done. Engagement is setting up some kind of a system where on all issues, you start out with input from across the community, including people you know are going to disagree with you, and get that information in early, deal with it, agree or don't agree, as Eric says, but get that input early so we don't end up with these odd standoffs on technical details and things like that. I think a lot of times things can be incorporated. And as I say, on stormwater, I think one of them is the kind of sacrifices that need to be made to stop the stormwater at the source.
Thank you. And, we do have a civic engagement sort of roadmap on how to do this. And what I will say is, I will work with our staff and get back to Sandy. We'll come up with it's not going to be super elaborate, but some sort of civic engagement plan a little bit with you all and with the community on this issue. And I think that actually will be helpful for us when we get to our CIP if there's been some work done ahead of time. So I will commit to doing that, and we'll be back in touch on that. Yeah. Yes.
Evening. My name is Ed Weiler, and I'm the delegate from the NARFE, National Active Retired Federal Employees Association. And I hasten to add what I'm going to ask. It's not a position of NARF, because this is not something we deal with benefits for federal workers. But
yeah, can you put the microphone close to your mouth? Yep.
But I do want to say that I recently heard on WMU radio, and there was a discussion about upzoning. And as you know, the city of Minneapolis has upzones such that it's by right zoning for multifamily and heretofore single-family zones. And immediately, folks started calling in and asking about what are the stormwater implications of that. And so that drove me to think about the same issue here, because my understanding is upzoning is on the table here. And so you go on the county website, and there is discussion about upzoning and how we need to start thinking about putting duplexes and triplexes on heretofore R6 sites. At the same time, we're saying, well, yes, we've got a stormwater problem here. And historically, Arlington County didn't take into account the stormwater implications of all this development. So we're in catch-up mode. I'm saying, well, wait a minute. On the one hand, we're in catch-up mode on stormwater, but we're going to storm ahead and make more density, which presumably you increase the footprint. I'm coming to understand that McMansions, that's bad additional footprint, but apparently 2 and 3 story or 2 and 3 unit structures on a site is good footprint. So I guess if someone could just speak to it, seems to me there's a contradiction here.
Yeah. Do you want to take that one? You want? Go
Can I
ahead.
say briefly? I think certainly exacerbating the issue through increased density is not what I'm interested in, but I also think it's a incorrect assumption that different designs will necessarily lead to worse outcomes, particularly when it comes to size, footprint, runoff from roofs and other elements of home design. So one of the things that we're interested in looking at, are there designs that are compatible with our existing neighborhoods that could accomplish the goal of accommodating different housing needs while at the same time making us more resilient when it comes from an environmental sustainability standpoint. I would encourage all of you not to accept as fundamental that a duplex will produce more runoff than a single-family home. It's a matter of design. And what we're seeing in Arlington are the proliferation of designs that have deleterious impacts. And from where I grew up and examples that exist elsewhere, higher density designs actually have a far lower impact. So that's the kind of thing that we want to look at for our community.
Ms. Kristen?
Just wanted to share one specific, although I think my colleagues would kill me if I say anything that makes it sound like we're going to do what Minneapolis did, right? We'll do the Arlington version that is significantly more tailored than.
But I'd like to say, even in Minneapolis isn't doing what people think Minneapolis is
Well, that's a great
do.
point, and that's exactly what I was going to say. So one of the things that was really interesting, the Alliance for Housing Solutions hosted the housing director from Minneapolis about 6-9 months ago. And she described that when they set about their zoning reform work, the first determination they made was that any additional density would need to be built within the same footprint of what was existing allowed to be built on a single family lot. So you could add more density, you could do the duplex or triplex, but the same amount of land disturbance as with a single family home. I'm not certain that that's the right policy for Arlington to set out at the gate, but I think it's absolutely one we should consider and entertain. And I think that will be one of the sort of foundational questions that starts to emerge as we launch the Missing Middle study, I think in late March or early April. So I think there are ways of doing it and saying, do we want to make that across the board determination as we go forward?
I just have one final question for you about the uploading. Julie Leland. I'm concerned, and he mentioned R6. I take you at your word that it is not a foregone conclusion. The results are not a foregone conclusion. I just want to make sure, will you be considering all of Arlington County? Will you be considering all of the neighborhoods? Because it may make sense to put multifamily units in an R10 or an R20 where you can still preserve green space, you can preserve trees, you have less worry about the impact of the sewer and the runoff and that sort of thing. And so my question to you is, are you considering all of the residential zones in Arlington as you consider this upzoning?
I mean, that's fully within the scope. So, and I think we'll look at it not only with lot size, but also in terms of proximity to major transit corridors, for example. So, absolutely. I think you'll probably see, I think the way our staff have scoped out our study is that the first phase would be to say, what are some of the forms that are missing in Arlington, whether they are the duplexes or the small cottages for senior living or something else, and a real understanding of what kind of forms we're interested in entertaining. Phase 2 would start to be, okay, where in the county do they go? What are the impacts relative to lot size, geography, proximity to transit, and so forth? So you'll start to see a little more of that where question explored in phase 2.
And if I just can, Libby, Julie, don't allow the ease or the passion with which we talk about this issue to lead you with the presumption that we have anything figured out. We're interested in studying it, to seeing its applicability to Arlington. And I'm just saying this as a general public service announcement, not necessarily just as a response to you, but I think so many people, they hear us speak about it fluently, they think, oh, there's some solution that they have in mind, they're just trying to lead us to, and that's just not the case at all. We are just interested in bringing this as a level of study and conversation with the community, because it's an idea that's appealing on its face, but until we kick the tires on it, we don't know how it would work, if it would work, and where it would work in Arlington.
And I appreciate that. I'm sorry, Libby.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, I think sometimes it's out there, the county board's going to upzone all of Arlington, and no, we're not. We're thinking this through. We're thinking about what we're going to do. We don't have the solutions yet. We're studying. We're going to work with all of you. None of us are interested in, destroying all our single-family neighborhoods, cutting down all the trees. We're not going to do that, because we love this place, too.
And I can tell you that you all have all been honest with me, and I think with everyone here. I believe that is true. The upzoning of all of Arlington, I think one of the other concerns is that you're not looking at all of Arlington, and that's why I bring it up, that you already have in mind exactly where you're going to upzone, and it is the R6s or below, and that is a concern that you increase, that you look at everything as we all look at everything, and make sure everyone is involved in this decision-making process. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I want to thank the...
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And I'm sorry, Max, because I've been...
Go ahead. I've lost control anyway.
Sure. No.
Done.
Last word.
I've tried to be pretty disciplined about trying to speak up, but I just do think that as we weave together stormwater and the questions on zoning, it's about how we grow. I think that Mr. Dorsey is right. We're not going to stay the same. When I was growing up, Fairfax County schools were not as good as Arlington County schools. We made big investments in Metro, and mixed use led to huge growth, and Arlington schools are better than Fairfax County schools in part because we put more resources. So as we're thinking about, I feel the urgency. I have 4 texts from people who got their homes destroyed, single-family homeowners, that I have not deleted for 3 months because it's on my mind. So I feel the urgency, and yet we have to think about these. The CIP is the right venue over the next 6 months, and we have to think about these questions, being honest that if we add supply, it's not going to drop prices for homes. But if we don't add supply, homes are going to be so expensive that none of your kids can afford to live here. So how we grow matters.
All right, and I think my vice chair really wanted the last word. Is that all right? Real quick. He says
Okay,
he'll be quick.
Yeah, it's your
Didn't
house.
intend for it to be the last
It
word,
is-
but
it is, I
thank
think.
you for indulging me. I couldn't agree more, Matt, that how we grow matters. And the only thing that I can really add to the conversation is when we're talking about all of Arlington and which zoning districts and all that, is that it is absolutely true that we are laying out a course to study this and come to our conclusion. We're not going to do Minneapolis, we're going to do Arlington, and to figure out what is it that we as a community want. And it will vary, I think, across the county and in different areas. I think one of the fundamental things that Arlington has proven through our history is that we have focused our growth and development where it's accessible to transit. We do transit-oriented development, and I think that that will continue into the future. The definition of transit in terms of broadening it to include bus transit and our major arterial corridors is likely, I believe, to be a big part of this, but not exclusively. So we also, because you could have access to other forms of transportation like bike trails and other things like that. So we're gonna look at that part of it. But I also am glad, Julie, that you clarified, because I think, Katie, to your answer, when the answer of, are we looking at all of Arlington? There's the inside out of that. Are we looking at possibly, are there neighborhoods being excluded from exclusion, from possible upzoning? No. But are we looking at upzoning all of Arlington in one fell swoop? The answer is also no. So I just want to make sure that was the distinction there of the inside out is absolutely understood.
Just one comment that I would have. I think providing the housing for the density that we need is important, and what I see is those corridors being hit because you feel like you have to provide transportation. People who can't afford to live here find their transportation to get here. So there is out in the ether here that you're looking at only the transportation corridors because it's there. And that shouldn't be the case. It's to provide the housing affordability, and then that'll come. The transportation will come. People will come to live here. So I think that's what I hear in the ether here. And throughout the summer, staff was meeting with people on those corridors. So if they were meeting with those people on the corridors, I hear nothing from North Arlington. I hear nothing from there. So I think that's where this comes from. So it's one thing to provide affordable housing, but you don't have to provide the transportation too. You can't do it all. So, but I want to thank you all very much for coming and for letting us come.
Thank you.
And for all your hard work. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. We'll be in touch.
And none of you leave, please. We have the rest of the meeting to go through. We just have 5 minutes, just 5 minutes of your time, okay? Okay. So, old business, livability. That's been sent to all the committee chairs for them to look with. Stacy and Eric will be contacting the committee chairs to talk about that. They'll set up private meetings. The juvenile detention home resolution will be in committees after the report comes out in January that deals with this. Yes, the Moss report. Housing and parks. Parks was tabled. Housing, the county's already acted on your resolution, which is different than what you put in. It's already in place. So that's kind of been tabled as well. So, but if you want to bring it up in a new iteration, Bernie, we can do that. Huh? Okay. Okay. All right. New business. We have these wonderful people that stepped up for the awards committee for the banquet. Duke Banks, Lois Kuntz, Rick Epstein, and Michael Beer. I need an approval from you for this awards committee. All right. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstain? Okay, good. All right, last thing. Upcoming meetings. No meeting in January, other than this one. Our executive board meeting is January 29th, 6 p.m. Firehouse 2. February 18th, 6:30 for social. Our regular meeting at 7 for our regular meeting. It'll be Arlington Public Schools, and we will have a panel on mental health trafficking for youth. And then March 17th meeting as well. So any other Business? Oh, I guess not. Okay. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Okay, thank you all. Great.
Should we do it with a mic?
Oh, I'm sorry, it goes up here. I'm so sorry. Thank you. I didn't mean to dump it on you, but I did.
No, you didn't dump